Let's go.
All right, our first speaker this morning has started 3 businesses, set transcontinental world cycling records, made 2 bids for U.S. Congress, and written legislation that has changed an industry. He is a business expert, serial entrepreneur, education advocate, transformational leader, and a man who embodies grit and perseverance. Please welcome to the stage the co-founder of Great American Cookie Company and former CEO of Caribou Coffee, Mr. Michael J. Coles.
Good morning. And you don't have to say good morning back. No test here. So as I was listening to KP and talking about what you all do and how it's changing, the things that you do could change the world, I was thinking about my businesses. They changed virtually nothing other than the fact that people got to enjoy some great products. I recently released a book, which is here, Time to Get Tough, How Cookies, Coffee, and a Crash led to success in business and life. And I wrote this book not to brag about any of the success I've had, but I wrote this book to try to encourage people to be able to think about doing more than they possibly may have thought they could. I think there's a lot of lessons in the book. There's a lot of stories about things that went wrong in the book, but most importantly, the lessons that I've learned came from the things, frankly, that did not go as expected. I don't know how many of you have been to a Great American Cookie store. If you have, you would look at them, and if you know the story behind it, we started the company with only $8,000. We borrowed $25,000. We never borrowed any more money. And we took that $8,000 investment, and over the period of time that we built the company, we built that $8,000 investment to a $100 million business. Now, when you hear that, you must think to yourself, at least I would think that that business must have gone extraordinarily smoothly from the very beginning. So let me just take you back a little bit, not even before we opened our first store, but let me take you back a little bit as to what it took to get our first store. So back in 1977, when we were getting ready to open our first store, we could not get a single landlord, and we lived in Atlanta, we could not get a single landlord to consider leasing us a space. And can I take this out of here? I guess I can't. Anyway, we couldn't get a landlord to lease us a space, and I know that's hard for people to understand today when you think about the amount of food stores that are in the malls today, like Cinnabon and yogurt stores and cookie stores and pretzel stores and all of that. But back in 1977, there were no single food concepts anywhere in America in any malls, other than the fact that there were a couple of hundred cookie stores, maybe 250 in the country that had just started springing up, which started back in about 1975. At any rate, the reason there were no single food concept ideas, except for, as I said, just a few cookie stores around the country, is that no mall developer or mall manager believed that a single concept food idea could actually do enough business to pay the rent. And so they just weren't leasing any space. We tried everything we could to try to get a lease here in Atlanta. And we finally were about to give up. We had already ordered all of our equipment. We were really anxious to get into the business. Perimeter Mall, anybody that's from Atlanta knows about Perimeter Mall. It's one of the most successful malls here in Atlanta. But in 1977, Perimeter Mall was the worst mall in Atlanta. It had been devastated by the opening of Cumberland Mall, which was a very big mall. It was the first real major mall in Atlanta, over 1 million square feet. Perimeter Mall, anybody that remembers back when it first opened, it only had 2 anchors. It had J.C. Penney at one end, it had Rich's at the other. Not a lot of stores, but it had done great for a while. Cumberland opened and just killed it. So an average mall in the United States back then was doing about $100 a square foot. Perimeter Mall was doing less than $70 a square foot. But they had brought in this new hotshot, mall manager, a guy named Jeff Weil, who was brought in to turn Perimeter Mall around. So we figured, even though all these other malls had not even thought about giving us a location, the worst mall in Atlanta might. And so we called Jeff on the phone, and he had no interest whatsoever in meeting with us. Wouldn't even take our phone call. So we tried for about a few days, and we finally decided that we were just going to have to show up and meet with him. So the day before we decided to go, we were in the Perimeter Mall parking lot about 7:45 in the morning, wanting to see about what time Jeff came in, because we figured we would have to try to see him first thing in the morning. Now, today we'd be arrested for stalking, but back then it was different. So we watched Jeff go into the mall. I got there about right after 8 o'clock, and we're thinking to ourselves, this is great. So we showed up the next morning. We go into the reception area, and my partner and I, Arthur, we say, we're here to see Jeff Weil. And the receptionist, of course, says, well, do you have an appointment? And we said, no, but we only need 5 minutes of his time. She said, well, he's very busy, and I don't think he's going to be able to see you at all. And we're like, well, it's okay. We're willing to wait. No problem. And she said, well, again, I don't think he's going to be able to see you. And we sat down on the couch, and we just said, no problem. We'll just wait. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, her phone rings, and we can only hear one side of the conversation. And it's something, like, yes, they're still here. No, I don't think they're going to leave. And about, maybe 8:45, 9 o'clock, we see Jeff's door open, and a very angry Jeff Weil is walking out of his office, because what the receptionist didn't know and what Jeff didn't know is long before the days of Starbucks and Caribou Coffee, the morning before, we saw Jeff walk in with a thermos of coffee. And we knew at some point after he got there, he was going to have to go to the bathroom. And the bathroom was through the reception area and across the aisle into the mall. And so sure enough, Jeff, very angry, comes out and says, what do you guys want? And we said, look, we've got, a cookie store idea that's very different than the way other people are doing it. And if we can just explain it to you, I'm sure you'll want to partner with us and give us that space at Perimeter Mall and let us open up. We'll make a hero out of you. And Jeff said, all right, I've got somewhere to go. I'll be right back. So we go into his office, and after about, a 10-minute pitch, he finally, when you meet with someone and they're all uptight, their arms are crossed, and they really are not listening. But after a few minutes, we could see Jeff loosening up. He finally relaxed his arms, and he finally looked across the desk. We could see he was smiling. We knew he liked us. And he started by saying, you know what, I really like you guys, and I'm going to give you the biggest favor of your lives. I am not going to lease you that space, because there was one store available right off Center Court. And we're like, what do you mean, Jeff? Why would you not lease us the space? And he said, look, you guys come out of the clothing business. You have no experience in the food business. You got $8,000 to start your business. There's already 3 big companies out there in the cookie business. If I was going to lease someone a cookie store, it would be one of the 3 big companies. And he said, you guys look like nice guys. You must have nice families, nice homes. I don't want to see you lose all your money and lose your family, your homes, everything else. And we just threw out this big telephone number, how much business we would do. And finally, Jeff relented and said, okay. And he pulled out a lease that was about that thick. And he said, I'll lease you the space under a couple of conditions. You take this lease to a very good lawyer and let that lawyer explain the personal guarantee. The rent on that space is $25,000 a year. You're going to have to sign a 10-year lease. It's $250,000, and you're going to have to personally guarantee it. And if you think you're going to wiggle out of the personal guarantee, forget it. This is owned by the Rouse Company. We're going to have you tied up every which way. And we're like, Jeff, the rent's not going to be any problem. It's going to be a slam dunk. He said, well, you guys go out and think about how many cookies you're going to have to sell to pay the rent, and think about a $250,000 obligation. And we walked out of there, our chests all pumped. We looked at each other and said, do you realize how many cookies we're going to have to sell to pay the rent? Anyway, we went to a bank and borrowed $25,000. We had to put up every asset that we owned, personally guaranteeing it. When I say every asset, it was our cars, our homes, all of our personal possessions within the home. We had to burst, basically nobody believed that this business could succeed. So we signed the lease on June 10th. We got ready to open our first store 19 days later on June 29th. We had no money for marketing, but we printed up flyers, and we figured that if we could just get these flyers around the neighborhood and all the mall employees around Perimeter Mall, and the pitch was that from 9 o'clock in the morning until 12 noon, we would give away free cookies. We figured if people would come and taste the product, they would come back. And so sure enough, we showed up on the 29th. We got there about 7 o'clock in the morning. We fired up the oven. We got ready to get our store open about 8:30. We put the first batch of cookies in the oven. Oven's 350 degrees. It had a window on the front of it. It was a big revolving oven, kind of like a Ferris wheel. And people out in the mall, which we didn't know if anybody would even show up for our opening day. But sure enough, there were probably 100 people out in the mall. The gate was down. They could see the cookies go into the oven. And sure enough, they're watching. People had their faces pressed up against the window. We put this 300 cookies in. They were all hand scooped. They kind of looked like ice cream scoops sitting on their tray. And as they kept going round and round, they went from kind of creamy white. They started flattening out. They started to crack. And 15 minutes after we put those cookies in, those little cracks had all this wonderful steam coming out. The cookies had reached the most beautiful golden brown color you have ever seen. This is a color that only belongs to chocolate chip cookies. If you take one of those cookies to Sherwin-Williams and try to match the color, it's impossible. Only chocolate chip cookies have this color. Now, the people out in the mall, 100 of them, the bell went off. They were like Pavlov's dog. They started salivating, knowing that any moment now they're going to get these beautiful, warm, delicious chocolate chip cookies for free. And so the employees of the store, which consisted of my wife, Donna, my partner, Arthur, and his wife, Susan, their son, Billy, and my mother, Lee, we had no paid employees because we couldn't afford them. We decided in a symbolic gesture to get our business going, we were going to all put our hand on this big oven door, kind of the way some kind of athletic team would do it just at the beginning of a game. This is it. We're about to launch this incredible business plan, what I would call it disruptive to the industry, the cookie business then. And we put our hand on that oven door and opened it up and peered in at these 300 magnificent golden brown chocolate chip cookies sitting on their tray at 350 degrees. And it was exactly at that moment we realized we had no oven mitts. We had nothing. We had no rags. We didn't have any napkins. We had nothing. We had no way to get the cookies out of the oven. Now, of course, people out in the mall have no idea what's going on. They're just watching the cookies continue to go around and round, from golden brown to a much darker shade of brown, to the cookies catching on fire on their trays. I promise all of this is true. Smoke was pouring out of our oven. We were on a combined air conditioning system with Park Lane Hosiery. People were running out of Park Lane Hosiery screaming because they thought the mall was on fire. The fire department came, and I remember looking out into the mall through this cloud of smoke, and I see Jeff Weil, the mall manager, weaving his way through the firemen to get to our store and asking one simple question. Is this what it's going to be like every day, guys? So we once again reassured him with this incredible business plan we had. He wasn't really buying in his office, and he wasn't buying it that day. We didn't get open on the 29th. In fact, we spent the whole day cleaning up a big cookie mess. We did get open the following day. We had to go around the neighborhood and all the mall employees with a new flyer that basically said, oops, but come on tomorrow, we'll give away free cookies. So now we show up at the mall, 7:30, the whole same routine. But when we looked out into the mall, there were like 500 people. This turned out to be the greatest marketing ploy anyone could have ever happened, because they showed up the next day, not so much for free cookies, but they were there to see, what are these two idiots going to do today? Are they going to finish the job and actually burn them all down? But it didn't happen that way. We did get open. We needed to do $12,000 worth of business in our first 30 days of business. In fact, we did over $30,000 worth of business. In 30 days, we became the highest revenue cookie company in the country. That perimeter mall store in its first year did over $500,000, eventually wound up becoming $1 million store. But in that first 30 days, with the success that we had, we didn't have to go begging for locations. We had shopping mall developers from all over the country offering us space. We had people applying for franchises from all over the country. Everything that you would think would be in place for the company to become a success seemed to be there. 6 weeks after we started the company, I woke up in Northside Hospital. It's a hospital just outside the perimeter here in Atlanta, with 2 doctors standing over my bed telling me that I was going to live, but had been involved in a near-fatal motorcycle accident. I would probably never walk normally again. But considering the idea of not waking up at all, I thought, this is okay. I started a rehabilitation program, but about 9 months after my accident, I had an incident with my daughter Taryn, who was 3 years old at the time, that virtually changed my business life and my physical life forever. We had a very steep driveway at our house, and she asked me if I'd race her to the mailbox. I was on 2 canes, but I figured even on 2 canes I could beat this little kid up the driveway. But when I took off to run, the pain was absolutely excruciating. And before I could make an excuse to her, she saw what was happening and said, Daddy, I really don't feel like running today. And it was devastating. It was the very first time since my accident that I realized that I was disabled. We did manage to get up to the mailbox, come back into the house, and I told my wife, Donna, there was no way that I could live the rest of my life like this, that if I had to do something else to try to be better and be able to race my kid up to the mailbox. So I started a self-styled rehabilitation program that eventually took me from a stationary bike to a regular bike. I started riding longer and longer distances from my home. And at the same time that we built the cookie company to its national success, I not only learned to walk again, but in the process set 3 world records riding across the United States on a bicycle. In 1982, I rode my bike from Savannah, Georgia to San Diego, California in just a little over 15 days. It was not my best effort. I knew it was not my best effort. And so in 1983, I attempted to do it one more time. I was less than 500 miles from San Diego. I was on a sub 9-day record. I would have finished in about 8.5 days. I would have broken my original record by over a week. But less than 500 miles from San Diego, I got blown off my bike by a dust devil, which is a dwarf tornado, crashed to the ground, and broke my collarbone, and the ride was over. So much to my wife's chagrin, I announced that following morning that I would do it one more time. And in 1984, against the worst possible weather conditions, I managed to get across the country in 11 days, 8 hours, 15 minutes, broke my record by over 4 days. And then in 1989, I joined a 4-man team to do the Race Across America, which went from Los Angeles to New York, some 3,000 miles. The 4 of us crossed the country. We won the Race Across America, and we crossed the country in 5 days, 1 hour, 8 minutes. It's the fastest crossing of America ever, and it's the fastest 3,000 miles ever covered under human power. And I'm very proud to stand there today to tell you that both records still stand. That was my big applause line. So I'm going to tell you 2 real quick stories. One of them is that as I talk to you about the cookie company and why I think the lessons in my book are pertinent to any business. If you think about what I said in the very beginning about signing a 10-year lease, personally obligate yourself for $250,000, borrow $25,000 from a bank that ties up every personal asset that you own, study the business for almost a year before you decide to open your first store, and know that you have to do it in a way that's different than what other people are doing, or there's no reason for you to be there. We did all of that, and we could have been put out of business by a $3 set of oven mitts. Now, my feeling is, and I think most of you will agree, the difference between success and failure is not what you plan for. The difference between success and failure is how you deal with the unexpected. The unexpected is going to happen. And you see companies that somehow fail to understand that when something happens that they were not planning for, they don't have no way of knowing how to handle it. Anyone in this room that's been successful has experienced exactly what I just said. And that's the big difference between success and failure, is dealing with the unexpected. The second thing I wanted to tell you is that on my rise, I know I talked about the fact that my life changed with my daughter Taryn in that experience we had trying to get up to the mailbox. But one of the reasons I said that it changed my physical and my business life is in the writing of this book, I had one of those experiences where you remember something you never remembered before. In 1984, as I described it, I had the worst weather conditions. Anybody that rides a bike in this room knows you can deal with cold, you can deal with heat, you can deal with rain, you can deal with all of that. None of those things can defeat you if you prepare for them. But the thing that is absolutely emotionally devastating is wind. I started in my ride in Savannah against a 30-mile-an-hour headwind that became a 70-mile-an-hour headwind by the time I reached California, to the point where you couldn't keep the bike upright. My body was totally beaten up during that. I only slept 22 hours in 11 days thinking that the wind would eventually stop. When I got to San Diego, my crew didn't know. I had a police escort in every major city across the country. But when we got to San Diego, we didn't know when or if I was going to get there. And so we could not arrange for a police escort, and we showed up at rush hour. They arranged for a friend of mine, a guy named Dave Johnson, who showed up, and he was going to be my escort. We couldn't have the motorhome behind me. We couldn't have any of the support vehicles. There was no way for them to get through traffic. They all went to the courthouse. Dave and I, with 4 water bottles, were going to make the last 5 miles to the courthouse. And when we left, it was the first time after Dave and I were on the bike for maybe a couple of blocks, I got stopped by a red light. It was the first time since I left Savannah that I had no control over when I was going to stop. Everywhere along the way, it was me that made that decision. This time, it was a red light. And so I stopped, and when I put my foot down, I started to feel my legs cramp. And I'm thinking to myself, this is not good. And then we got back on the bike. We got to the next light, which was probably another few blocks. And this time I put my foot down, and my legs cramped up so bad that I honestly did not believe that I was going to be able to keep going. I remember looking over to the right, and there was one of those blue mailboxes, that kind of rounded mailbox, and it looked like, one of those sleep comfort beds to me. And I looked at Dave and said, I'm done. I can't finish. I got to get some sleep. And he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. And he said, no, let's just try to make it to the next light. And I did, obviously. And I kept one light to the next light to another block. And then we made a right turn on Broadway a few miles from the courthouse. There were people lining up the streets clapping. They knew we were coming. The adrenaline kicked in. And I managed to finish. But what I just described to you, I did not remember at all. All I remembered was my crew leaving and me showing up at the courthouse. That whole incident in between was gone from my brain. But the book somehow brought it back out, and I wrote about it. And the lesson that I learned in that incident was so important to the rest of my life and my business life. It was that it doesn't matter how many miles you ride. It doesn't matter if it's thousands of miles. It doesn't matter how many hours we put into a process or into something that we're about to launch. It just doesn't matter how much time you put in if you don't finish. Because if you don't finish those last 5 miles, it will never prepare you for the next 5 miles. And so for me, that is what has led me through my entire business life, which I've been very, very fortunate with. You know, one of the things I talked about in the beginning is that when this incident with my daughter Taryn happened, I was devastated about the fact that I was disabled. And I was living in a safety zone that doctors had given me. It was the first time in my life that someone had told me what my limits were. And I basically was living in a safety zone of doctors. I grew up as a very poor kid. And so all through my business career and my life, people always told me my limits, and it always gave me the encouragement to prove them wrong. But when I was 10 years old, my dad went bankrupt, and it didn't really affect me until I was 13 because we still had most of our family possessions, and even though we lost our house and I had to give away my dog, bankruptcy to me when my dad went bankrupt meant you give away your dog, you move back to an apartment. That's all it seemed to me. But 3 years later, my dad always thought he'd recover, and he kept overspending. And so we had to finally move out of where we were living in upstate New York, and we had to move to Florida, which was a debtor state. And I remember, my parents, we lived in a fairly nice 3-bedroom apartment up north. And now I woke up, we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that was about less than 300 square feet in Miami Beach with no air conditioning. And I remember waking up the following morning thinking to myself, I've got 2 choices here. I can still think my dad's going to recover, or I can try to help my family. And so the following day, I woke up determined to get a job to help my family. And I remember thinking to myself, I need some encouragement. I need something to make me believe that you can overcome this kind of adversity. And I went back to the first story I ever remembered about overcoming adversity, and that was the story of David and Goliath. And that story runs throughout my book. But I remember thinking about that story and how many people always, their takeaway was the fact that David won this battle against this enormous giant, a small man with nothing but a slingshot and a few stones. The giant had armor and weapons, and that's a great takeaway, certainly. But for me, the takeaway from that story was always that David had the courage to step into the valley without knowing the outcome. And for all of us, every single day, whether it's learning to walk again or changing careers, going back to school, going through a horrible divorce, whatever it may be, all of us face Goliath challenges every single day. And the question we really have to ask ourselves is whether we have the courage to step into the valley. Thank you. I think we have some time for a couple of questions. Yeah, if anybody has some questions. Yes. Up till last year, I sold my motorcycle last year, only because I have a home that I couldn't put it in the garage. But I still rent motorcycles and still ride. Yeah. So my accident was a freak accident. So, yes. Well, not as many as I once owned. Well, I was sponsored by Bianchi, and every year Bianchi would give me 3 bikes. And so for 5 years, you can do the math, I had 15, and then a few other companies started sending me bikes. The most I had was 21 bikes. And by the way, one thing I do want to mention, my book, all of the profit from the book, any of the royalties from the book, all go to Kennesaw State University, where my wife and I have had an involvement for a very, very long time. So I just wanted to mention that. And all the bikes that I had, with the exception of one, were all donated to charity and some auctions and things like that. People, wanting the bike. So, okay, yes. Man, am I glad you asked that. So I didn't intend for the cookie business to be my business. What happened was I was in California and I saw a cookie store. I was in the clothing business. I'd been in the clothing business since I was 13 years old. And the business was changing, like a lot of businesses. It was moving overseas. the reason I had moved to Atlanta, because I came to Atlanta a long time ago. The clothing industry was centered here. It was all about non-union labor and cheap labor. And over a period of time, cheaper labor was available in Asia. And so the movie was moving overseas. And I was traveling about 3 days a week. I had three small kids. I knew now I was going to have to travel like 3 weeks a month. And I literally came back from California and said to Donna that I don't want to be gone that much. I'm going to have to find something else to do. I had a clothing company at the time, coincidentally called the Great American Clothing Company. Yeah, I'm not very original. And so I came back and told my partner that I wanted to sell my interest to him. And I said to Donna, let's open a cookie store. A is the key word there, a cookie store, until we figure out what we're going to really do for the rest of our lives. My accident just changed all that. 6 weeks after we started the company, and I woke up and I couldn't walk. I was on a walker. It's not the way it is today. I mean, I think you could show up at a job interview, today on a walker and be on crutches. But back then, I mean, you just be shoot out the door. And so I had to focus on the business, and what could have been a terrible tragedy in my life, in fact, turned out to be a great triumph, because the cookie business, by the time we sold, like I said, we had over 400 stores. Company did over $100 million in sales, and it turned out to be just okay. But that's how it was. The cookie. It could have been anything else. Then I went on to do Caribou Coffee and a couple banks, and it's been okay. Someone else had a question? Yes. I get that question quite a bit, and I would say that I'm not sure I have an answer for it, but obviously it's like a lot of industries that got overbuilt. It's not like every mall in America is going to go away, but they're going to have to change dramatically. One of the things that, if you remember back in the early days, by the way, if you want to think malls are going away, go to Lennox, try to find a parking place. So it's not like every mall in America is dead, but the biggest thing is that when malls first opened, they became the town centers of most communities. Everything that used to happen in the town square happened in malls. They would have, antique sales. They would have art shows. They would do all of that. And they've kind of stopped at that point. I think that what malls are going to have to do is recognize that you don't put Costco 300 feet away from the mall. You make it an anchor. You probably have to redefine what those anchor stores look like, as opposed to just being traditional retail stores. I think that you need to have a Whole Foods as an anchor. You need to have a hotel in a lot of cases as an anchor. You just maybe office space, maybe a WeWorks kind of thing. Bring that into the mall. But malls are going to have to change, and a lot of them are going to have to go away. There's just too many, and there's too many outdoor, type of open air malls. But just like retail's not going to go away, malls are not going to go away, but there's going to probably be a lot less of them. Yes, by the way, when you write a book, everybody thinks you have an answer to everything. So, yes. So I was chairman of the board of Brand Bank up until September of last year. I had been really focused on helping build that bank. When my partners and I recapitalized the bank, it was doing about 700 million, and 6 years later, it was 2.5 billion, and we sold it to Renaissance Bank out of Tupelo. So I found myself in September for the first time in my life without a paying job. And so it was very different. But the book came out in October, so I spent a lot of time promoting that. The truth is, over the last 10 years, I've been spending more and more time on nonprofit work, because I really believe that, if you live in a community or if you live in this country, you have to give back to a country, for me, that has done so much for me. And so I've been deeply involved in a lot of nonprofit work. I'm very involved at Kennesaw State University. I mentor a bunch of young people. I was very fortunate to have a mentor when I was 13 that probably saved my life. And so I've tried to pay that forward. I do some consulting on retail. I have a, I don't know much, honestly. I learned this when I was 13. It's guided me my whole life, which is I'm all about customer experience, period. I really believe that if you focus any business, it doesn't matter whether it's technology or lawyers or doctors or cookies, whatever it is, you've got to focus on customer experience because it's a very competitive world. If you can differentiate that experience with customers, then I think you can be, sustainably successful. And so that's primarily what I focus on. If somebody wants to get me involved in helping them figure out how do you keep this business solid going forward, I bring it right back to taking care of customers. So, anyone else? Yes. Um, Youth. When I was 22 years old, I won a sales contest for the company I was working for, and I flew back on a plane with a guy that today would be on his own jet. But there weren't personal jets back then. Anyway, and as we got off the plane, I was sitting. My company had bumped me up to first class, and so I was sitting next to this guy. And as we got ready to land, I looked at him and said, "What advice would you give a young guy that is about to enter, wants to be an entrepreneur in the world?" And he looked at me without hesitation. He said, "Take your risks as early as you can take them, because the older you get, the more complicated your life's going to get." Um, I've definitely taken that advice. But I think the thing on the cookie business was, I think I recognized from the research that most people didn't really understand how big the business was. That it was a big opportunity, especially in the way we disrupted it. And I really felt like if we could just get one store open, it would be very successful and it would begin to lead to other stores. I was not, like I said, I was not expecting it to become my business, but I figured 4 or 5 stores in Atlanta would give me a business that would give me a cushion to do whatever else I wanted to do. Once I had my accident, I had to focus so hard on that business, I could not afford for it to fail. People will say to me, "Well, how did you keep focused with that kind of adversity?" I couldn't afford to fail. But it was also one of the first times I realized what my dad had gone through, because my dad never recovered from it. But eventually, he accepted what he was doing, and we were very, very close. But yeah, so that's it. Okay, one last question. What was disruptive? See, these are great questions. I love this. Um, well, are you from Atlanta? Have you ever been to a Great American Cookie store? Well, let me just put it to you this way. Uh, one of the things I knew was that if you ever go to a kid's birthday party and they serve a cake, they eat the icing, and about 3/4 of the cake are left over. And I always made my kids these big cookie cakes, and so decorated, and that was the big disruptive. We had showcases, it looked like jewelry store showcases in the very first store that had these big cookie cakes decorated in all different ways. And because I knew that we could not survive as an impulse business, that we had to become a business where people went to, as opposed to just impulse. And so ordering a cookie cake would force people to have to come to the mall. If we had tried to survive on single cookies or even half or dozen cookies, we never would have made it. 40% of our business was cookie cakes, very, very profitable. And other people kept trying to do it. We did it so simple. We could train anybody to decorate a cookie. They were trying to bring in, decorators and spending a fortune. That's not really, it was not necessary. And so that was one thing. The other thing was, most of the people that were in the cookie business at the time came out of the bakery industry. They had no idea about upselling. They had no idea about suggestive selling, buy 6, get 1 free, that kind of thing. So it was a big change. Today everybody does it, but we were the first business in a mall to ever sample. Now think about that. Today, you can't, you can go eat your lunch just through sampling, walking through, Costco, for God's sake. Anyway, thank you all very, very much. The book is for sale in the lobby.